So we're going to look at Peter Lindbergh. For many, he was the photographer's photographer. He just took the kind of pictures that most other photographers wanted to take and created that sense of feeling and relationship with the models that so many photographers strive to create in their work that just feels like supernatural, uncontrived, models at ease. And we're going to have a look at his work and how he achieved some of it. I'm going to assume you know some of the background of Peter Lindbergh or you're already a Peter Lindbergh fan. But just a couple of pointers about him and why he's important and what he sort of established. Considering the time when he was photographing and when he kind of really came onto the scene, he pioneered a more stripped back style of photography, working with models that were kind of on the cusp of stardom but maybe didn't know it yet, and showing them in a fairly unfiltered, natural way, which wasn't really the norm at the time. He ended up using loads of equipment and having really big teams, but that wasn't the way at the beginning, and he still managed to keep that same aesthetic in his work even when the teams got really large. And you'll see it in some of the footage of him. He's a very touchy-feely photographer, but it seems very natural, builds a great relationship with his models. They seem to genuinely adore being around him, and that connection seems very genuine. So he's able to create these very choreographed but almost loose moments where the subject feels at ease, feels natural, doesn't rely on a vast amount of hair and makeup or lighting or retouching. Although there are elements of all of those things in his work, it's just more stripped back than people are used to seeing. And mainly today we're going to focus on his outdoor work, the kind of beach sets that he was really famous for, and his particular way of working with a light tent, which was also kind of the reverse of how everyone else would approach a light tent. And you can see that in some of this intro imagery. Also, I should say there's some really good documentaries on YouTube about Peter Lindbergh, some from the Foundation, some from German TV. They're really worth checking out. This fashion TV stuff is from a Pirelli calendar that he shot. And we're not going to focus on this. There's big production with loads of flags and diffusers. We're going to focus on something a lot more simple. But I think it's really worth looking at these to get a sense of the man, to get a sense of where his work ended up, and just that elaborate choreography and direction and teamwork. But this is the real focus today. These really basic light tents. And we're going to talk about why they work and how they're so effective and what he was trying to achieve with them. And also the sense of space he was trying to create. That idea of controlling light and what's real, what's prop light, what's actual light he's using to create his imagery. And he would use it for everyone, actors, models, groups of people, individuals. There's a real range, even though it's the same technique over and over again. Built a new model for this. I'm not using the normal satellite that I would do for the simulations because I really wanted to create that outdoor feel. And there's some equipment you wouldn't necessarily have on a beach, but it's just in the set already because I was working on it. As always, I'm trying to show how you can implement some of these ideas. So we're not going to get super detailed in this is the specific 6x6 or 12x12 that he was using. So with that in mind, we're going to jump into the world. Also for this, I've located it somewhere in Southern California. I've got two time frames, so I've got a midday sun and then an afternoon sun, and they are realistic. They're based on where the sun would actually be at that time of day and the geographic location, because I think it's just more helpful. And let's look at what this actual light box is, because that's really important. And we're boxed in on sides. We've got this drape here, a curtain, and really what we're looking for is some kind of black fabric. And he would have been using normally commander cloth or duvetine. And duvetine is a specific cloth that lets in a certain amount of light depending on its opacity. It should be fire retardant. It's easy to rig. It's quite lightweight. But really, the main thing is it's a black drape. Also, it's quite matte. It almost has a brushed side to it. And that's important because we're trying to kind of soak up light and control light. We're not trying to bounce it into our subject. If we just lift that wall up, we can see our set inside. And this could be rigged with scaffold poles, or you could use standard backgrounds. Really, the idea is to make it as easy as possible. If you go back and see the beginning of the footage again, you'll see that he rigged it in different ways, different times. Also, again, depending on your budget. Also, again, always worth saying, if you're going to rig anything outside or rig anything anywhere with people underneath it, you need to make sure it's secure and safe. Let's spin around to the back. We'll come to this element in more detail, just to show you what we've got here. And I've chosen to put this on a frame because it's just easier to build the model that way. What we're looking at is a fabric that is opaque, translucent, somewhat see-through. There will be different materials you can use for this. If you've got something already in your studio, like a quarter silk, for example, could work for this, but it's really important that light passes through it. And let's just lift that up so we can see just the back of the set. And again, this needs to be rigged or tied to a vertical. So you're creating a box. Spin around to the other side. And again, this is going to be another black drape. So the duvetine that we had on the other side of the set, we're just going to exactly reproduce that. Again, if you're kind of thinking, how can I do this cheaply? Polyboards, for example, could work. Polyboards, I wouldn't fully recommend putting them on a beach because they're really hard to secure and they're going to kind of blow away. Just trying to kind of present you with some solutions that you can implement yourself. But essentially, again, this is drape or curtain on another scaffold pole, just to show there's nothing else going into the set. Again, this will be tied and weighted at some point. And let's zoom around to the front of the set so you can see the front of the set is open. Also, this is kind of midday that we're looking at this now. If we look at the shadows, they're pretty much under whatever's happening. The sun is overhead, so there's pretty harsh lighting. I've also got a polyboard in here. We'll come back to the polyboard a little later. It's not essential for everything that he was doing, but he does use a polyboard to just emphasize some contrast or structure if he needs to, and also as a prop and posing. But I've left that in there for the basis of this tutorial. And now we can look at the top. And the top is the same as I've got in the background in terms of his 8x8 or a 10x10. But this will be a black negative fill again. So this also you could do with black fabric if you drape it over the top. This is not opaque and it's not see-through. So just to be clear on that, at the minute, only the back wall is the one that's opaque or see-through. And what we're trying to do with that is create this light box that is really only working on the ambient light that's created by the sun. Still going to fill into the space, but it's going to be really soft, and the shadows also are going to be really soft. Let's just drop one of his images in so we can see. There's no additional light on these images right now, just the black box. So you can see he's working with ambient light. He's exposing for the subject within the light tent, and he's got that real softness. And we can see that when we zoom in. The other thing that also might be important at this stage is, depending on what your surface and where you are photographing, is to have some kind of black on the floor also. We're trying to limit the amount of bounce light in there, not give a real kind of up light feeling, controlling where all of that light spill is. This is a really soft negative fill space that we've created. And you'll see photographers use things like this with white walls and ultra bounce, but it's a very different feel. And as I move around the set, you'll see some Arri lights, for example, in there. We will use those a little bit later, but don't worry about them too much right now. And in the images that he creates, the set varies whether it's like a one person or a group shot, but the tent is normally fairly standard sizes. It's not super high because we want that negative fill all the way around the model. So let's look at the back. We're going to be letting in quite a lot of ambient light, but it allows us to shoot out without completely blowing out the background. If we didn't have that there, we'd really struggle to balance that exposure on the face, but also again, it adds this element of softness and it gives another layer to the background, which gives it this filmic kind of cinema quality to it as well. The other thing that I've got on the floor is another black material here, which right now the photographer stood on. Depending on the position of the sun, we might get a lot of bounce that is going back into the light box. And what you might notice is then you get sort of an up light, or it's too distracting. So what you might need to do is have black outside the tent, or as I've done here, let's just replicate the roof. We'll just kind of copy that. And we've also got black negative fill. And you'll see this in some of his other imagery as well, where there's a negative fill at the front. But it's just about controlling the front of that. I've got mine just off the ground now just to demonstrate roughly what it's doing. And obviously you'd need stands and so on to get that to happen. But just to give you a sense of, we're trying to block as much light as possible, get that real soft ambient light and those soft shadows. And let's just see that from the front. The other thing also to kind of consider is just sort of making like a safe space. I know it's a very modern term, but the model for the subject. And this is really important, I think, when you think about his relationship with the models and how he's working. Like, that space becomes theirs. The interaction comes between him and the model, regardless of how many other people are outside that tent. So there's a psychological element to this also. So yeah, where I am with the mouse now, just illustrating, we've got all this like amazing light. It's a strong sunlit California day. It's like midday. There's a lot of light bouncing around. And that light, even though we've made these black panels, is still going into that space. And then we've got that backlight coming through the rear screen. And if we look at some of the images, again, we can see that real softness. He was shooting on film, shooting pretty fast. When you watch some of the video of him working, it's like tiny movements. It's all kind of natural feel, but he's really looking for the light. There's little tiny glimmers that you see, kind of cheekbone, jawline, and so on. That's what he's really looking for. And again, that tent sort of slows down that process and allows you to kind of really see the light, how it's shaping the face. You're not being blinded by all this crazy sunlight that's happening. And you're not getting, obviously, those heavy shadows that you would normally get with midday sun that's blocking out eye sockets and just being really harsh. It allows the models to look good, no matter which angle they're kind of working with. It's a very flattering light because of that softness of the shadow. And then the other thing that he would do is add additional lights. He used a lot of film lighting. There's also imagery that you'll see where he's using a beauty dish, which I've made another video on. I think maybe that's only on TikTok. But let's look at adding some additional lights. So putting these Arri lights on. And we can do two things with that. We can work with the idea that, okay, it's still sort of midday, 1 in the afternoon, and we're pushing in light from the front. And we would need a fairly strong Arri light to do that. But again, these are not going through like big diffusion panels. They're quite kind of raw, the lights. And I've got at the minute 2 Arri lights from the front. I'm just using the one on the left, camera left. And then I've got one from the back, which you'll see on that screen. Get into this in a little bit more detail. That's the back one going on and off. And that's going to push some kind of clip light. And then this front light, we're going to kind of vary the angle and like rake it across the face a little bit rather than having just a flat light. Or the other thing we can do is really move it from a flood to a spot. So it's really just pulling out the face. And like I said, you'll see some beauty dish shots where he's got a very much harder shadow around the nose, for example. And that's using beauty dish and a strobe light. But here we've got a constant light. And it's about getting that balance between the ambient light and then the artificial light that you're putting in and not getting a massive difference between them in terms of exposure. And I'll put up some of his images on the side now so we can see that. Again, it's like accent shaping light. Here I've got that front Arri, spotting it pretty much onto the face. And then I've got the back light, which I'm pushing through. Again, depending on how bright your sunlight is, you would need to vary the distance, how much of a highlight you're getting through, and also what material you're pushing that through at the back, just to show you the rear of the tent. So I switched this to dusk now, just to bring down that feeling of the overall ambient light. I think that's quite important to also show. And now we're going to switch those lights back on and off just to emphasize what's happening if we're putting artificial light back into them. The Arris are at the same power as they were earlier for the Midday version, but we've got that kind of warm golden light. He was shooting a lot of black and white, some of its color in the tents. Let's just take out that rear screen for a minute. And you can really see now what the rear screen is doing, how much that light is blocking and kind of filtering and just calming down and making more diffused. When we take it away, that light is still flooding in. And again, this is a realistic kind of depiction of 6 p.m. Southern California. So we can punch light in from the front, going from a spot to a flood. And then I'm moving that angle of the light and again, just kind of raking it around so it's glancing past the face rather than hitting directly onto the face. So if you look at his images, you see these small movements that I mentioned, these ideas that like little highlights are passing through. He was very enamored with movie lighting, and there are elements of movie lighting in a lot of his work, even in the early work. And you can see that in some of these model shots now, but he's accenting that light. It's not doing all the heavy lifting. And again, we could bring that polyboard in if we want to shape. So if we're putting artificial light and it's that dusky quality, the light overall, the ambient light has dropped a little bit, we can then use those polyboards to shape and contour. Or we can take the polyboard out completely, and you'll see that he used the environment of the tent a lot. So shooting against the fabric, having the model really close to the edge of the tent, so they're just catching a little bit of the light and the rest of it's falling off into shadow. But again, it's not like super concentrated, super contrasty shadows. It's softness. And just give you that sense of looking for the light. I've got a slightly warm and slightly cool also, just to give a different element of how the highlight would blend in. So if we're looking on the left now, this is cooler, and on the right-hand side, it's slightly warmer. Again, as we've talked about in other videos, that sits that highlight back a little bit. And this is a really great example, I think, of the dusk period to see what that back screen is doing, that opacity. If you look towards the edge of the frame and you can see the background, see how crisp and clear that is on the outside, whether you aren't seeing the material, and then what that opaque silk is actually doing. And when the light dips low, it's really beautiful effect. Now I'm just exposing a little bit more for the face here as I move the camera around. You see that highlight now that's coming across the face? That's from that backlight, and it's just accenting. Zoom out so you get a sense of that more. And if you watch some of the behind the scenes video of him, like I said, he's always searching for that little movement. Also a lot when he's shooting in this tent, the models are seated, really tiny gestural movements, super flattering light. Let's just talk briefly about the hair and makeup. It always gives the impression of like the model or the subject could have been swimming in the sea. It's not too perfect. The hair, again, there's some great footage of the hair artists that he was working with, just really kind of messing up the hair, giving that deconstructed look. It's some of those elements when people try and recreate his work, they sort of miss out on. Quite cream or quite powdery, really matte. And it looks very lived in. Most of the time it doesn't look like the model has just come out of hair and makeup. Just this idea of searching for the light, right? We're kind of raking light into the set. We're using our soft shadows. We're pushing light across the edges of the set, which is going to give us some kind of textural quality as well. Also, I'm bringing the side of the set in now. And he would show parts of the frame also, but with this one, I really want to kind of bring that in and just make it more about the curtain and the drape so it doesn't become too much about a photography set, and just find what the angle could be. Now we're just going to look at the idea of using props, just stuff that was around his set. Again, he would bring the models out of the set because you're still kind of blocking a lot of the light. You're not putting someone in direct sunlight, using the environment of the light tent. And you'll see that he shoots around his set quite a lot of the time. So again, bringing that polyboard in, we're just trying to kind of block some of that clip light again now, pushing in with a front light. We could rake that light across the face, or we could turn it off completely. It's just about getting that right balance between the ambient light of the sunlight. It's making sure our shadows aren't too heavy. So here I'm just moving that angle of that light, feathering the light to some extent. And I dropped some of the pictures in where you can see him shooting around the set on the side of this now. And just give you that idea that it is about watching and observing the light and how it shapes the face. It's not about that fixed idea of setting up a studio setup and saying, okay, the model has to stand on the gaffer tape mark. Also, in terms of how he was shooting, there's quite a lot of slower shutter in this. Images that are kind of slightly missed focus, have a bit of motion blur. They kind of add to that filmic quality, that storytelling, and that sort of tenderness that you see in the pictures. Not everything is like crispy sharp. And let's just focus on that back panel. This is that afternoon sun. I'm just taking out that back panel now and putting it back in. And you can see how much light is flooding into the space. Obviously, it depends on what direction you're shooting, where the sun is, but even with an afternoon light, that back panel is super helpful of just really controlling the light, making it more diffused, making it more subtle, adding that sense that our shadows are going to be softer shadows, and it's a really controllable highlight. And if you look at some of his really, really early work, or some of the stuff that he was shooting even sort of beside the light tent, it was about using negative fill or about using diffusion panels. So I'm going to show you what I've got here. So this is a midday sun again. You can see that by the shadow that's coming down. It's pretty much like directly under the negative fill. So here I've maybe got like a 6x6 rigged above the model. Again, make sure it's safe. And I've got a black negative fill on. That allows us to put the model in shade, but get all that nice ambient light that's coming around from the sun still and exposed to the face and get a softness to it. Really control the light. The other thing that we could do, we can have a diffusion panel over the top. Some kind of silk, just trying to control some of that sunlight that's coming through. That's going to give a more diffused feel than if we had the negative fill. The negative fill will give us these really nice soft tone shadows, sit everything back a little. But using a shoot through diffusion like this will give us that kind of additional highlight across the face, but it will still give us light into the eye sockets and not make everything too heavy, because we'll also be getting bounce light off the ground, the surface of the sand. Again, if you want to control that even more, you could put black material on the sand itself. And it's about them maybe moving the model further back into the shade or having them kind of creep forward so they're at the edge of the area between the light and the shade. Just really controlling that textural quality, controlling those shadows, making them not too dark, not too heavy. So hopefully that helps. Just to recap, we've got a negative fill tent. We're using ambient light. We're using a back panel that allows light through because it's got some opacity to it. We can also shoot outside the tent, so we can shoot the front or the sides of the tent, still using that negative fill, still blocking some of the sunlight. The model was really just stood in shadow, but that means that overall the shadows are very soft. This image of Cindy Crawford with the apple boxes here. He's finding his angle. He's using the negative fill to really shape the face. Look at that light that's coming through at the side of her cheek, which is pushing through that back net. It's such a soft, beautiful highlight. But then look at the opposite side. See how soft those shadows are. But it's not super contrasty. Softness to everything. Here's a great example with the models in the kimonos. I see that highlight that is on the hair that's coming from that backlight that's pushing in. The softness of the skin, the softness of those shadows into the skin. No heavy shadow under the chin. David Yeoman, Kate Moss image. Highlight that is on this cheekbone, that's pushing from the back. That's that light that's coming through the soft net at the back. See how that beautiful shadow comes down the arm where it's meeting the front light? It's really shaping, but it's not a heavy contrast shadow. And even if you look towards her chest as her head is down, in kind of natural daylight, that shadow would be really intense. But because you're in this dark light box, the shadow fall off is really controlled and really beautiful. Let me just find you a version of this that has artificial light. So similar thing in Kate Moss here. The light that's raking across we see that strong line of shadow under the chin. That could be direct sunlight. That could be artificial light. So it could be, say, a beauty dish that's coming in. It looks like it's artificial light by that little shadow that you see across the nose, also that has that hard edge to it. Double page spread with the 5 models. Look at that background. We're looking at that really diffused background because we're looking at the image essentially kind of projected on the back material of the tent, the shoot through. Super soft light at the front. Skin tones look really nice. On the blonde on the right hand side, again, see that highlight that's coming down there? That's that ambient light or direct sunlight that's pushing through the diffusion panel at the back of the tent. I just showed the last picture of Kate Moss also because this is a studio shoot. You can see the interior here. But again, it's the same principle he's using. He's got this nice gray drape, using a big black curtain, to block over most of the ambient light, but just letting a bit of that light push through, which is hitting the face. Really master of lighting, obviously. I hope I'm kind of doing it justice in some way, talking about it. The Another Magazine, the thing that I really love about this Another Magazine shot, the sandbag is kind of pulling you into the subject. You've got those horizon lines that are coming down, but again, it looks like this kind of beautiful like rear projection feel. It looks like Solange's been photographed in a studio with a painted backdrop. Really textural quality. Super simple, really clever. And a final one here, this is probably just a black backdrop that doesn't have a kind of roof over it, so it's not a tent, but the light is behind, so you're still shooting in the shade. So if you can't get enough people to kind of build a tent with you, or you don't have enough fabric and material, you could just put up a black backdrop, shoot outside, shoot with the sun behind the black backdrop so that you're kind of really shooting in the shade and just use a little bit of an ambient light that creeps around the edge of the set. So I hope that was useful. I hope you can see how it's really shaping the light, how it works beautifully with skin tone and muscle tone, and also though how it's creating this like intimate space, this real connection between the subject and the photographer, which is sort of a trademark of what he was doing. If you have questions, let me know. Hopefully you liked it. Hopefully you subscribe. So yeah, thanks for watching.